The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, which should have been my first warning that the week was going to be a complete disaster. I was standing in my kitchen, still in my bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold because I'd been watching the snow pile up on my driveway and mentally calculating how much my lower back was going to hate me when I finally went out there to shovel. It was the kind of cold that made your nose hairs freeze the second you stepped outside, the kind where your car took 3 full minutes to warm up, and even then it groaned like it was personally offended you'd asked it to work in these conditions. Ridgemont Estates had been buried under about 14 inches of snow over the past week, and more was coming according to every weather app on my phone. So I was standing there, dreading the shoveling, when I heard the mail slot clatter and a thick envelope hit the floor. I picked it up, saw the return address, Ridgemont Estates HOA, CO Marcia Chambers, Community Standards Coordinator, and felt that specific kind of dread that only HOA mail can produce. It's different from regular dread. Regular dread is a stone in your stomach. HOA dread is that stone plus a headache plus a preemptive surge of rage. I ripped it open right there in the hallway, still in my bathrobe, cold coffee in one hand. The letter was 3 pages long, 3 pages, single-spaced, with a highlighted section on page 2. I'm going to quote the most important part directly, because I've read it so many times I have it memorized. Dear Mr. Eric Marshall, it has been brought to the attention of the Ridgemont Estates Homeowners Association that your property at 14 Birchwood Court is currently in violation of Section 7, subsection 12, B, of the Ridgemont Estates Community Standards and Aesthetic Guidelines. Specifically, your home is displaying icicles along the gutter line of the roof line, which present an unapproved aesthetic alteration to the exterior appearance of your home. You are hereby issued a formal violation notice and required to remove said icicles within 48 hours or face fines beginning at $150 per day. I read it twice. Then I walked to the window and looked at my gutters. There were icicles hanging from them. Big, beautiful, completely natural icicles that had formed because it was 17 degrees outside, and there was snow melting off my roof during the brief afternoon sun and refreezing when the temperature dropped again at night. The same thing that happens to every gutter in every part of the country that gets winter weather. The same thing that happens to icicles on every house on every street in Ridgemont Estates right now. I looked down the street. Every single house had icicles. Every single one. I grabbed my phone and texted my neighbor Dave, who lived 2 doors down. Did you get a letter from the HOA about icicles? 30 seconds later, he sent back a string of expletives followed by yes. What is wrong with these people? I called my neighbor on the other side, Linda, a retired school teacher who had the patience of a saint but had been losing it lately over HOA nonsense. She picked up on the first ring. Eric, I was just about to call you. I got a violation notice for icicles, natural icicles on a house, in winter. So it wasn't just me. Marcia Chambers had apparently decided that this Tuesday in the coldest week of the year was the perfect time to issue violation notices to what I would eventually find out was 37 homes in our neighborhood. 37. For icicles. Now let me tell you a little about Marcia Chambers because you need to understand who we were dealing with. Marcia had lived in Ridgemont Estates for 11 years and had been on the HOA board for the last 6. She was in her mid-50s, always wore her hair in a tight bun that seemed to pull her face into a permanent expression of mild contempt, and drove a silver SUV she kept so clean it looked like it had never once encountered actual weather. She had a talent for finding rules in the HOA handbook that nobody knew existed and wielding them like weapons. She'd previously issued violations for a doormat she decided was too colorful, a basketball hoop that she claimed was asymmetrically positioned, and a wind chime that she'd filed a noise complaint about even though wind chimes are explicitly not covered under the noise ordinance. She lost that one eventually, but only after making the homeowner, a quiet guy named Frank who worked nights and just wanted something to listen to when he sat on his porch go through 3 rounds of dispute hearings. The thing about Marcia was that she was organized, persistent, and extremely good at using the HOA rulebook to make your life uncomfortable. She'd memorized every section and subsection of the community guidelines and could cite them from memory the way lawyers cite case law. She also had an extremely convenient relationship with the HOA's legal counsel, a guy named Gerald Pearson who charged by the hour and whose fees came out of our HOA dues. Whenever Marcia issued a violation that got challenged, suddenly Gerald was involved, and suddenly our dues were paying for letters and hearings and all sorts of administrative theater that conveniently never seemed to go anywhere except to Gerald's invoice. I stood in my kitchen, looking at that violation letter, and I thought about 2 things. The first was that it was literally 17 degrees outside, and there was no safe or reasonable way to remove icicles from gutters without a ladder and a death wish on an icy morning. The second was that Section 7, subsection 12, B, of the community guidelines didn't actually say anything about icicles. I knew this because I'd read the entire HOA handbook the previous spring after the basketball hoop situation with Frank, specifically because I wanted to be prepared. I'd made notes. I had a digital copy saved in a folder on my laptop called, and I'm not proud of this, HOA Defense Files. I went and pulled it up. Section 7, subsection 12, B read, "Homeowners shall not make unapproved permanent or semi-permanent alterations to the exterior appearance of their property, including but not limited to paint colors, decorative additions, structural modifications, or landscaping changes that deviate from the approved community aesthetic standards. Permanent or semi-permanent. Icicles are ice. They melt. They are by definition the most temporary thing that can exist on a house. They form, they hang there looking beautiful and natural, and then the temperature goes above 32 degrees and they're gone. Calling an icicle a semi-permanent alteration to the exterior appearance of a home was like calling fog a permanent reduction in visibility or calling a puddle a permanent change to the landscaping. I started typing notes, but before I could get very far, my phone started buzzing. It was Dave again. Neighborhood group chat is blowing up. Everyone got a letter. I counted at least 20 people already complaining in the chat. Linda's saying she's going to call the city. Frank is losing his mind. Mrs. Patterson from the corner is threatening to show up to the next board meeting with a lawyer. The neighborhood group chat was called Ridgemont Neighbors and had about 80 members. I opened it and watched the messages coming in fast. A cascade of outrage from people who were already dealing with frozen pipes, propane shortages because the delivery trucks couldn't navigate the icy roads properly, cars stuck in driveways, and all the other joys of a deep winter freeze. And now on top of all that, they'd gotten a 3-page letter from the HOA telling them they were in violation because water had frozen on their gutters. Someone had already taken a photo of their violation letter and posted it in the chat. Someone else had posted a photo of the entire street, showing every single house with icicles hanging from the gutters, with the caption, "So we're all in violation." Really, Marcia? That photo got 17 thumbs ups in under 2 minutes. I started thinking about strategy, because I'd learned from dealing with the HOA before that raw anger, however justified, almost never gets you anywhere. You have to be smarter than them. You have to use their own rules against them. You have to document everything, stay calm in meetings, and know exactly which pressure points to push. The first thing I did was request, via the official HOA contact form, a complete copy of all 37 violation notices that had been issued, the date and time each was issued, and the name of the person who had authorized them. The HOA bylaws required them to provide this information to any homeowner who requested it, and they were required to respond within 10 business days. I noted the date and time of my request. The second thing I did was put on about 4 layers of clothing, grab my phone, and walk up and down the street taking photographs of every single house. I got shots of the icicles hanging from gutters. I got shots of the natural ice formations on roof lines. And I got one particularly good shot of the street itself, showing that this was a completely uniform, natural winter phenomenon affecting every property equally. I also noticed something interesting while I was out there. The one house on our street that did not have icicles was Marcia Chambers' house. Because Marcia had electric gutter heating cables running along her roof line, a modification she had installed 3 years ago, and those cables prevented ice from forming on her gutters. So she'd given herself an advantage that prevented the exact natural phenomenon she was now fining everyone else for. I photographed those heating cables too. When I got back inside, my fingers were numb and I'd gone through 2 hand warmers, but I had a complete photographic record. I uploaded everything to my laptop, organized it by address, and wrote myself a summary document. Then I posted in the neighborhood chat, "Everyone who got a violation notice, please keep yours somewhere safe. We're going to need them. Do not pay the fine before we talk. I'm looking into this and I think we have a very strong case." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Dave offered to coordinate a meeting. Linda said she'd reach out to her nephew, who had done some HOA law research during a dispute with his own HOA in another state. Frank said he still had all his documentation from the wind chime situation and would bring it. Mrs. Patterson, who was 73 and the fiercest person on the street, said she'd been on the phone with the city code enforcement office that morning and had some very interesting information to share. We agreed to meet at Dave's house that Thursday evening. Dave had the biggest living room and was willing to make chili, which in 17-degree weather was not a small thing. In the meantime, Marcia apparently became aware that the neighborhood was organizing, because she sent a follow-up email to all 37 households that same afternoon. The email was what I can only describe as aggressively polite. It opened by expressing her deep concern for the community's well-being, which coming from Marcia read like a surgeon expressing deep concern while sharpening a scalpel. It explained that icicles posed a significant safety hazard to pedestrians, guests, and vehicles parked below the roofline, and that the HOA was issuing violations not out of punitive intent, but out of genuine care for the community. It cited 2 incidents from a neighboring development, not our development, a different one somewhere else, where falling icicles had caused property damage. Now, this was actually a somewhat savvier argument than the original violation letter, which had framed icicles purely as an aesthetic violation. Suddenly, they were pivoting to safety. I recognized this pivot immediately because it's a classic HOA move. When your original justification is weak, find another angle. Safety is a particularly good angle because it's emotionally compelling and harder to argue against without sounding like you don't care about safety. But I'd been expecting this. I pulled up the city's municipal code, which I'd bookmarked. The city had a specific ordinance about snow and ice removal from residential properties. It covered sidewalks. You had to clear them within a certain number of hours after snowfall. It covered driveways. It even covered certain types of overhanging trees that could drop ice onto public sidewalks, but it said nothing about icicles on residential gutters. In fact, the city's own website, in their winter safety tips section, specifically noted that icicles were a normal product of winter weather and provided tips for managing them safely, tips that involved things like being careful when walking near buildings in freezing weather, not tips about mandatory removal. I also looked up the state's stance on HOA authority and found something very useful. In our state, an HOA could only enforce rules that were actually written in the duly adopted governing documents. They could not invent new rules mid-season and enforce them immediately without following the amendment process, which required a majority vote of the board at a properly noticed meeting, followed by a 30-day comment period for homeowners, followed by a final vote. Marcia had not done any of that. She had simply issued violations citing an existing rule that didn't actually cover icicles, banking on the assumption that people would either be confused enough or intimidated enough to just pay the fine. It was a bold strategy. It was also, I was increasingly confident, an illegal one. Thursday night arrived cold and dark, which in January meant it was both of those things by 4:30 in the afternoon. The roads had been treated with salt, but they were still slippery in spots, and getting to Dave's house 3 doors down required a bit of careful shuffling along the sidewalk that hadn't been fully cleared yet because, ironically, the HOA-mandated snow removal service hadn't shown up on schedule. Apparently the company the HOA contracted had trucks that were struggling with the icy roads. I noted this too, because it was relevant. The HOA was failing to deliver its own contracted services while simultaneously fining homeowners for naturally occurring winter weather. Dave's living room was full. I counted 31 people packed onto couches, folding chairs, the stairs, and a few just standing in the doorway eating chili out of bowls. The energy was exactly what you'd expect, frustrated, cold, and ready to do something about it. I stood up and walked everyone through what I'd found. I kept it simple and organized, because the worst thing you can do in this kind of meeting is get everyone fired up emotionally without giving them something concrete to do. I explained the actual text of Section 7, subsection 12, B, and why icicles didn't meet the definition of a semi-permanent aesthetic alteration. I explained that Marcia's pivot to safety in her follow-up email was a sign she knew the original justification was weak. I explained the amendment process that the HOA was required to follow before enforcing any new interpretation of the rules. Then Mrs. Patterson, who had commandeered an armchair in the corner and was drinking tea with the calm authority of someone who had seen several decades of nonsense and was no longer impressed by any of it, spoke up. She said she had called the City Code Enforcement Office, as she'd mentioned in the chat, and had a conversation with an officer named Terrence who had confirmed that there was no city code requiring removal of icicles from residential gutters, that the city did not consider natural icicle formation a code violation, and that if the HOA was issuing fines for something the city explicitly did not require, and those fines were being mischaracterized as safety-related city requirements, that could potentially constitute misrepresentation. She'd asked Terrence if she could get that in writing. He'd said yes. She had it in her email. People started talking over each other at that point, which I let go for about a minute because sometimes people just need to process out loud, and then I brought everyone back to focus. Linda's nephew had emailed her a summary of his research, which she read aloud. The key point was that in our state, an HOA fine that was based on a misapplication of the governing documents could be challenged as unenforceable, and any homeowner who had already paid such a fine could potentially seek reimbursement. Furthermore, if the HOA had collected fines under a deliberately false pretense, that could rise to the level of fraud. That word fraud landed heavily in the room. Frank raised his hand and asked the question everyone was thinking. Was Marcia actually committing fraud, or was she just wrong? And this was where I had to be careful, because there's a difference between someone who makes an honest mistake in applying HOA rules and someone who deliberately misrepresents rules to extract money from homeowners. From what I could see, the original violation letter had cited a rule that genuinely didn't apply to icicles. The follow-up email had then invented a safety angle that contradicted what the city code actually said. Whether that was deliberate misrepresentation or just aggressive incompetence was something a lawyer would need to assess. I suggested we pool together and hire an HOA attorney, not for litigation necessarily, but for a formal legal opinion that we could use in our dispute filings. Several people agreed to contribute. We calculated that with even 15 people chipping in, we could get a solid consultation. We also agreed on a few immediate action items. First, nobody would pay the fine. Second, everyone would submit a formal written dispute through the HOA's dispute resolution process, which the bylaws required the board to respond to within 30 days. Third, I would compile everyone's evidence into a single organized package. Fourth, we would attend the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in force. Before everyone left, Dave brought up something that nobody had mentioned yet, which was that the next HOA board meeting was supposed to cover the budget for the year, including the allocation of dues toward various services, including Gerald Pearson's legal fees. Dave had looked up what the HOA had paid Gerald over the last 2 years by requesting the financial statements, which homeowners were entitled to see. The number was substantial, and a significant portion of it was for matters that appeared to be violations that had been challenged and then quietly dropped, which meant homeowners were paying for Gerald to threaten them, and then paying again through their dues when those threats turned out to be baseless. The room got very quiet when Dave said the number out loud. I drove home that night thinking hard. The Icicles situation had started as something absurd, a bureaucratic overreach so ridiculous it could almost be funny if it didn't involve actual money and actual stress for people who were already dealing with a genuinely brutal winter. But it was starting to look like it was part of a pattern. Marcia issued aggressive violations. People got scared or confused and paid the fines or backed down. The HOA collected money it wasn't entitled to, and Gerald got paid to provide legal cover for the whole thing. Whether Marcia was doing this for power, for control, or for some financial benefit we couldn't yet see, the outcome was the same. Homeowners were being taken advantage of. That changed things for me. This wasn't just about Icicles anymore. Over the next few days, I worked. I organized the dispute filings, helped people fill out the forms correctly, and made sure every single one cited the specific text of Section 7, subsection 12b, and explained precisely why Icicles did not qualify as a semi-permanent aesthetic alteration. I included the city code confirmation from Terrence, the photographs of every house on the street with Icicles, the photograph of Marcia's gutter heating cables, and the digital timestamp showing that the violation letters had been issued during the worst week of winter weather in 2 years. I also did something I probably should have done months ago. I filed a request with the state HOA registry, because our state required all HOAs to register and file annual reports for the complete financial records of the Ridgemont Estates HOA for the past 3 years. This was public information. It just took knowing to ask for it. The Tuesday board meeting was held in the community room of the Ridgemont Estates clubhouse, a room that normally held maybe 40 people comfortably for things like wine tastings and book clubs. That night, 63 people showed up. Every chair was taken, people were standing along the walls, and the temperature in the room went up noticeably from body heat alone, which after a week of 17-degree weather felt almost pleasant. The board consisted of 5 members. Marcia sat in the center with her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a stack of folders in front of her. The other 4 members, 2 of whom I'd had limited but cordial interactions with, and 2 of whom I barely knew, looked visibly uncomfortable with the turnout. The board president was a guy named Robert Hartley, an accountant in his 60s, who had always struck me as basically decent, but completely unable to stand up to Marcia. Marcia opened the meeting with a prepared statement. She explained, in a measured and confident tone, that the Icicle violations were issued out of genuine concern for community safety and in accordance with the community's governing documents. She said she understood that some homeowners found the timing difficult given the weather, but that safety could not wait for convenient weather. She said that homeowners who found the fine a hardship could request a 30-day extension. She said all of this with the practiced calm of someone who had done this many times before and expected the crowd to gradually settle down and accept the situation. Then she opened the floor for public comment, which the bylaws required. Mrs. Patterson went first. She walked to the microphone. Yes, They had a microphone. This was that kind of HOA with her printed email from Terrence at the city code office and read it aloud, slowly and clearly. The room was completely silent. When she finished, she looked at Marcia over the top of her reading glasses and said, "The city does not require icicle removal. The city does not consider icicles a code violation. So the safety justification in your email last week appears to be inaccurate. Would you like to respond to that?" Marcia said the city code and the HOA guidelines were separate documents and the HOA could have higher standards than the city. Mrs. Patterson said, "That's true, but only for rules that are actually in your governing documents. Icicles aren't in the governing documents." Marcia said she disagreed with that interpretation. Mrs. Patterson sat down. I went next. I read the text of Section 7, subsection 12b into the microphone. I read the definition of semi-permanent from the glossary of terms at the back of the Community Guidelines Handbook, which described semi-permanent as anything that cannot be removed within a reasonable time frame by normal means and does not naturally reverse. I pointed out that icicles melt. They reverse themselves. They are the opposite of permanent or semi-permanent. I said that issuing a violation under a rule that demonstrably did not apply was an improper use of HOA authority, and that every one of the 37 homeowners who'd received a violation notice had formally disputed it. I said that the homeowners had collectively retained legal counsel and that our attorney would be filing a formal challenge if the violations were not withdrawn within 15 days. I watched Marcia's expression while I said that. Something flickered in her face, not panic exactly, but a recalculation. She hadn't expected organized legal counsel. Then Dave got up and talked about the financials. He presented a breakdown of Gerald Pearson's fees over the past 2 years, which he'd obtained from the financial statements he was entitled to see. He noted that the total was significantly higher than what had been disclosed in the annual HOA newsletter's budget summary. He asked the board to explain the discrepancy. Robert Hartley started shuffling papers and looking at Marcia, who said that legal expenses were a normal part of HOA operations and had been properly disclosed in the detailed financial statements. Dave said that was interesting because the detailed financial statements had only been available to homeowners who knew to request them, and the newsletter, the document most homeowners actually read, showed a number that was substantially lower. He asked whether that was an oversight or intentional. Marcia said it was a formatting issue. Dave said he hoped so, because intentionally presenting misleading financial information to homeowners could constitute a fiduciary breach. The room buzzed. Robert Hartley called for a 10-minute recess. During the recess, I got a text from Linda. She'd been doing her own research and had found something I hadn't seen yet. She forwarded me a screenshot of a post in a different, private HOA board Facebook group that Marcia appeared to be a member of, where someone had posted asking about strategies for increasing HOA fine revenue during winter, citing icicles, unshoveled walks, and holiday decoration violations as reliable sources of quick fine income in January and February. The post had several enthusiastic replies. One of them with a username that matched a personal account that Marcia had connected to in a public comment somewhere else, had replied, "Icicles are gold. Nobody knows it's not actually in the rules until after they've paid." I read that twice. My hands were steady when I forwarded it to our HOA attorney, who I'd called from the parking lot of the community center. The attorney's name was Carol Vance. She was about 45, specialized in HOA law, had handled about 200 HOA disputes in 12 years, and had the voice of someone who found HOA overreach both professionally interesting and personally infuriating. When I forwarded her the screenshot and explained the context, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Eric, this is potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. If that account can be confirmed as Marcia's, And if the HOA was deliberately issuing fines it knew were not supported by the governing documents in order to collect fine revenue, that is not a civil HOA dispute. That is potentially criminal. I went back inside for the second half of the meeting. When Robert Hartley brought the meeting back to order, he looked like he hadn't enjoyed the recess. He announced that the board would be taking the Icicle violations under advisement and that no fines would be processed while the disputes were being reviewed. It was a partial retreat, the kind of language boards use when they want to buy time without admitting they were wrong. I stood up and said that was not sufficient. I said we needed the violations withdrawn, not just paused, and we needed it in writing within 15 days. I said that our attorney would be contacting the board directly in any case, and that the communication would address not only the Icicle violations but also the financial discrepancies Dave had raised. Marcia, for the first time that night, looked genuinely rattled. The meeting ended on an uncomfortable note for the board and an energized one for the homeowners. People left talking, comparing notes, making plans. There was a feeling in that cold parking lot, everyone wrapped up in coats and scarves and boots, breath fogging in the night air, of something having shifted. The next 2 weeks were busy in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Carol Vance sent the board a formal legal letter that was, by her own description, polite but loaded. It laid out the case that the Icicle violations were unsupported by the governing documents, cited the governing documents' own amendment process as evidence that no properly adopted rule about Icicles existed, referenced the city code confirmation, and noted the financial discrepancy issues. It also, carefully but unmistakably, mentioned that the HOA's actions might be reviewed under the state's consumer protection statutes. Gerald Pearson responded, also politely, and also loaded, essentially arguing that the HOA had broad discretion in interpreting its own rules and that the financial statements were fully compliant. Carol wrote back with a point-by-point rebuttal that was frankly impressive to read. Meanwhile, I'd submitted a formal request to the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, describing the situation and providing the documentation I'd collected, including the social media post that appeared to show the violation was issued knowingly without valid rule support. The state AG's office was slow, which I'd expected. Government processes are not known for speed, but they acknowledged receipt of the complaint, which was something. What happened faster was the neighbor network. Linda's nephew had connected us with a local TV consumer reporter named Angela Reyes, who covered exactly this kind of story: HOA abuses, hidden fees, that sort of thing. Angela was interested. Angela was very interested when Linda showed her the photograph of the entire street of icicle-covered houses next to a copy of the violation letters. She was especially interested in the social media post. Angela contacted Marcia for comment. Marcia declined to comment. Angela contacted the HOA board president, Robert Hartley. Robert, apparently having conferred with Gerald about the potential media attention, said the board was reviewing the situation and expected to provide an update to homeowners shortly. The story ran on a Thursday evening news broadcast. It wasn't the lead story. There was actual news happening in the world. But it was a solid 3-minute segment with footage of our street, icicle-covered houses glittering in the winter sun. A brief interview with Mrs. Patterson, who was magnificent and said exactly the right amount in exactly the right way. And a chyron that read, HOA fines homeowners for icicles in deadly cold snap. The segment mentioned the financial discrepancies, described the social media post without definitively attributing it to Marcia, since they hadn't confirmed the account, and noted that the HOA had declined to comment. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by 3 other local news outlets and a national homeowner advocacy website. I was getting texts from people I barely knew asking if they could share the news segment. The Ridgemont Neighbors group chat was moving faster than I could keep up with. And somewhere in there, Someone posted a screenshot of a review on the Ridgemont Estates HOA's official page. Apparently they had one that read simply, "Find me for weather." 2 stars. Which for some reason made me laugh harder than anything else in the entire situation. Meanwhile, the weather continued to be terrible, which was its own kind of irony. We got another 6 inches over the weekend. The propane delivery situation had still not fully resolved for 2 families on the far end of the street who were running low, and the road conditions were slippery enough that I'd personally watched 3 different cars lose traction trying to get up the hill at the entrance to the neighborhood. I organized a quick neighborhood effort to help the 2 families dealing with propane issues, getting them space heaters, and connecting them with an alternative supplier who could get there faster. That had nothing to do with the HOA situation, except that it reminded me what a neighborhood actually was supposed to be about, and it made the contrast with Marcia's operation even starker. 3 weeks after the initial violation letters, Carol Vance received a response from the HOA board that was, if you read between the lines, a fairly complete capitulation dressed up in carefully neutral language. The board stated that, following a thorough review of the governing documents and legal counsel's advice, it had determined that the Icicle violations had been issued in error and were being formally withdrawn. All 37 violations would be voided. Any fines that had already been paid, there were actually 4 homeowners who'd paid before our meeting, understandably not knowing to wait, would be refunded within 30 days. The board expressed regret for any inconvenience and noted that it was committed to accurate and fair application of the community guidelines. What the letter did not do was mention Marcia by name. What it did not do was explain how 37 violation notices got issued for something that wasn't actually in the rules. What it did not do was address the financial discrepancy or the social media post. Carol said this was expected. The board was trying to make the immediate problem go away without exposing themselves to further liability. But the broader issues, the financial questions, the social media post were still in play. The state AG's Consumer Protection Office had been moving, just slowly. About a month into the situation, they sent us a letter acknowledging that they had opened a preliminary inquiry into the complaint. This was bigger than it might sound. An AG inquiry is not an investigation yet, but it's not nothing either. It meant someone with actual authority was looking at it. Then something happened that none of us had anticipated, and it accelerated everything. It turned out that someone on our street, I'll just say it was a particularly tech-savvy neighbor I'll call Marcus, who'd moved in about a year ago and kept mostly to himself, but was clearly paying attention, had noticed something in the HOA's financial documents that Dave and I had both missed because we didn't know quite what to look for. Marcus was a forensic accountant by trade. He'd looked at the financial records I'd shared with the group and found a line item that didn't add up. There was a category labeled Administrative and Legal Recovery Fees that appeared to be income to the HOA, meaning fines collected, and the total was significantly higher than what could be accounted for by the violations that were publicly documented in the violation log that homeowners could request to see. In other words, there was money coming in as fine revenue that didn't correspond to any publicly documented violations. Marcus wrote it up in a clean, professional memo, 5 pages, with the relevant numbers highlighted and the discrepancy clearly explained. He sent it to Carol, who sent it to the AG's office. The AG's office upgraded their preliminary inquiry to a formal investigation. A formal investigation by the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division meant subpoenas. It meant actual investigators. It meant that the HOA's financial records were no longer just something homeowners could request copies of. They were evidence. I found out the investigation had been formalized through Carol, who'd been notified by the AG's office. She called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was working from home in a sweater and fingerless gloves because my furnace was having one of its January moments. and said, "Eric, this is now significantly more serious than an HOA dispute." She walked me through what the AG's investigators had found in their initial review. The discrepancy Marcus had identified appeared to represent approximately $40,000 in fine revenue over 3 years that was not matched to documented violations. $40,000. It had moved through the HOA account in ways that were not consistent with normal operational expenses, and some portion of it appeared to have been directed toward personal benefits for at least one board member. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked Carol if that was fraud. She said that if it could be proven that a board member had knowingly diverted HOA funds for personal benefit, yes, that was fraud. Potentially also embezzlement. Marcia Chambers was brought in for questioning by investigators on a Friday. I know this because Marcus, who by this point had become a central figure in everything, saw the investigator's car outside her house and let the group know. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't a certain grim satisfaction in that, but mostly what I felt was tired and a little sad that it had come to this, because it always takes something like this to reveal how badly a community can be run when the wrong person is in charge for too long. Gerald Pearson, it turned out, had not actually known about the diverted funds. He'd been issuing invoices and getting paid from the HOA account in good faith, and when the investigators looked at his invoices, they matched up with documented legal work, overpriced as it may have been. Gerald was not charged with anything. He did, however, sever his relationship with the HOA, which, given everything, seemed like the right call. The board held an emergency meeting in February to address the situation. By this point, Robert Hartley had retained his own personal attorney, and the other 3 board members had done the same. Marcia did not attend. She had resigned from the board the previous week, effective immediately, in a 2-line letter that said she was stepping down for personal reasons, and she thanked the community for the opportunity to serve. It was the most restrained thing she'd ever written. At the emergency board meeting, Robert Hartley read a statement acknowledging that the board had failed in its oversight responsibilities, that an investigation was ongoing, and that the board would be cooperating fully with authorities. He announced that the board would be pursuing an independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years, funded by existing reserves, and that the results of the audit would be presented to homeowners at a special general meeting. He also announced that effective immediately, all fine revenue would be tracked in a publicly accessible log updated monthly, and that any fine above a certain threshold would require approval from at least 3 board members rather than being issuable by a single board member. These were good changes. They were changes that should have been in place from the start. The formal charge came down 6 weeks later. Marcia Chambers was charged with 1 count of misappropriation of funds and 1 count of misrepresentation in connection with HOA administration. The misappropriation count related to the diverted fine revenue. The misrepresentation count related to the Icicles violations, and the pattern of issuing fines under rules she could be shown to have known did not apply, based in part on the social media post that Angela Ray's team had ultimately confirmed was linked to Marcia's account. I'll note, because it's important to be accurate about this, Marcia was charged, and she entered a plea negotiation, which is not the same as being convicted, and the process played out over months, slower than anyone wanted. But the charges were real, the evidence was substantial, and the outcome, when it came, was accountability. She pleaded guilty to the misrepresentation count and no contest to a reduced version of the misappropriation count, paid a significant fine, was required to complete community service, and was permanently prohibited from serving on any HOA board in the state. The money that had been misappropriated was recovered through the enforcement process and returned to the HOA account. 4 homeowners who had paid the Icicles fines got their money back. 37 violation notices were permanently expunged from the records. The independent audit found the financial discrepancies Marcus had identified plus a few smaller ones, all of which were addressed in the remediation process. The neighborhood held a general meeting in early March, the first proper spring thaw meeting where you could start to smell something other than cold air and road salt. The new interim board, Robert Hartley, stayed on temporarily, and 3 new volunteer board members were recruited, including Linda and Dave, presented the audit results and the remediation plan. The meeting lasted 2 hours and was remarkably productive, partly because people were genuinely engaged in a way they hadn't been before, and partly because everyone now understood that an HOA is only as good as the attention its homeowners pay to it. Mrs. Patterson was elected to the board, which was the best possible outcome anyone could have imagined. She immediately moved to establish a standing homeowner advisory committee that would review any new fine issuances before they went out, which passed unanimously. Marcus, to nobody's surprise, was asked to serve as an informal financial oversight volunteer, reviewing quarterly statements and flagging anything that looked unusual. He agreed, but said he wanted it formalized in the bylaws, which was exactly the right instinct. They formalized it. The Icicle rule, or rather, the non-rule, the thing that was never actually in the guidelines, was addressed directly. The board, following the proper process this time, proposed and voted on a new, clearly written guideline specifically about exterior winter maintenance that covered things like ice dam management and gutter care, written in plain language, with specific and reasonable requirements that didn't involve fining people for naturally occurring ice formations. The proposal was circulated to all homeowners for comment, which is how it's supposed to work, and after incorporating several good suggestions from the community, it was adopted at the spring general meeting. It was a reasonable rule. Nobody objected to it. As for Marcia's house, she listed it for sale in April. I saw the sign go up on a Saturday morning when I was out clearing the last of the late-season slush from my driveway, and I stood there for a moment, shovel in hand, watching the real estate agent take photos of the front of the house. The gutter heating cables were still installed. They gleamed a little in the spring light. Somebody in the neighborhood suggested we should take a formal group photo in front of the Ridgemont Estates sign, icicle violation letters in hand, as a kind of commemoration. We did actually do this, in a joking way, one afternoon in late February when we got one more snowfall, and the street looked properly wintry again for what turned out to be the last time that season. Dave made hot chocolate. Mrs. Patterson wore an excellent coat and looked entirely unbothered. Frank brought his wind chime, just because. Linda brought her nephew's HOA law research summary in a binder, because Linda is a retired schoolteacher and organizational instincts die hard. I stood in the middle of the group holding my original 3-page violation letter, the one that had started the whole thing, and I thought about how strange it was that a piece of bureaucratic overreach about frozen water on gutters had ended up exposing a years-long pattern of financial misconduct and leading to actual criminal accountability. You never know what the icicle is going to be. That was probably the lesson, if there was one. You go about your winter, worrying about shoveling and heating bills, and whether your propane delivery is going to show up before you run out, and you don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about who's running the HOA or what they're doing with the dues you pay automatically every month. Most of the time, most HOAs are just a minor background irritant, the occasional sternly worded letter about lawn height or holiday decoration timing. You grumble about it and move on. But sometimes the person running things is doing more than applying inconvenient rules. Sometimes the absurd is covering something darker. And when that happens, the best thing a neighborhood can do is exactly what ours did. Read the actual rules, document everything, get professional help, stay organized, and refuse to be intimidated. The certified letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, when I was standing in my kitchen watching snow pile up on my driveway. By the time spring came around, the snow was gone, The icicles were long melted, and the street looked like a completely different place, same houses, same people, but something fundamentally different about the way we related to the place we all lived. People stopped to talk more. The neighborhood chat was still busy, but the tone had changed. Less venting, more organizing, more of the specific practical energy of people who'd learned that paying attention to their community was worth the effort. I went out and cleared the last of the slush from my driveway that Saturday in April, watching Marcia's real estate agent drive away. My back was fine, actually. I'd gotten a new lightweight shovel in February after my old one cracked in the cold, and it made a noticeable difference. Small improvements, practical solutions. That's usually how things get better. Not all at once, but steadily, one cleared driveway at a time. The sun was warm enough that afternoon to feel genuinely spring-like for the first time in months. I stood at the end of my driveway and looked up at my gutters. Clean, clear, completely, triumphantly free of both icicles and violation notices. I went back inside, made a fresh cup of coffee, and this time actually drank it while it was hot. It was, all things considered, a very good cup of coffee.